I've always known how to enter a room. Not with noise, not with desperation, with presence. The kind of silence that doesn't whisper weakness, but power so certain it doesn't have to announce itself. That's the way I was raised. Not in chaos, not in warmth either. In order, protocol, reputation. I was the daughter of the Sloan legacy, the next in line for a family empire that had existed longer than most countries have had constitutions. When you carry a name that's carved into marble lobbies and embossed on venture agreements, you don't grow up, you're groomed. By 12, I knew what a trust was. By 15, I could tell a Patek Philippe from a Rolex blindfolded. By 19, I'd already sat in on acquisition strategy meetings as a junior observer. And the thing was, everyone expected me to excel. I was the capable one. The one who didn't flinch under pressure. The granddaughter who brought actual numbers to quarterly dinners while everyone else brought stories and cigars. I was always poised, always prepared, always predictable. And they loved that about me until they didn't. The Sloans had rules, not all written, not all spoken, but very real. You earn everything. You smile publicly and bleed privately. And above all, you never, ever humiliate the family name. Grandfather loved to say I was born in the boardroom. I used to laugh when he said that, until I realized it wasn't a compliment. It was a prophecy. From the age of 6, I wasn't told bedtime stories. I was read investor letters. At 10, I was expected to write thank you notes and fountain pen to any adult who gifted me stock shares instead of toys. By 17, the phrase, "You'll run this company one day," stopped being a compliment. It became a command. I didn't resist. I adapted. Learned how to walk the knife's edge between femininity and dominance. How to sip champagne and still memorize tax codes. How to smile at men who underestimated me and use their confidence to disarm them. But I was never the only Sloan. Daniel, my cousin, the golden boy, the charismatic one. He wore custom loafers and cologne that cost more than my first car. He knew how to tell a story, how to charm a room. He never read the minutes before a board meeting, but he always had the chairman's laugh by the end of it. And while I was being prepared to inherit, Daniel was being taught how to win. We never competed openly. That would have been too gauche. But there was always tension, like two swords displayed side by side, gleaming in the same case, waiting to be chosen. Still, I never once thought he'd try to cut me. Not him, not family. Because for all our differences, we shared the same bloodline, the same grandfather, the same name embroidered on our school blazers. I thought that meant something. I thought legacy was armor. What I didn't realize was that it was also a target, and that the higher they lift you, the longer you fall. People romanticize wealth. They think it smells like roses and leather, that it feels like silk sheets and soft music on a private terrace. Let me tell you something, wealth smells like old paper and contract ink. It feels like control, like expectations stitched into your bloodstream, pressed into you like embroidery, too ornate to escape, too fragile to fight back without tearing the whole thing apart. Growing up in the Sloan dynasty wasn't a dream, it was curated. My days were booked months in advance. Etiquette tutors, equestrian competitions, philanthropic dinners I barely understood, and summer language intensives in places where the locals barely looked me in the eye. I was taught how to fold napkins like royalty before I was taught how to say no without consequence. I was taught how to own a room, not how to belong in one. The family estate was called Valliswood, not a home, but a monument. Ivory gates, black marble floors, a koi pond the size of a tennis court. We had a chef trained in Tokyo, a butler who used to serve in the Swiss consulate, and security so discreet you'd forget they were watching until you tried to step outside protocol. Valliswood was beauty encased in ice, and Daniel, he was the flame that never melted it. Where I was raised in discipline, he was raised in indulgence. He grew up in the East Wing, what the staff jokingly called Versailles Junior. His mother, my Aunt Lucille, believed her son was destined for greatness by birthright, not merit. Daniel was sent to all the right schools, failed spectacularly, and somehow came back with glowing references. He crashed a Lamborghini at 17, and grandfather brushed it off with a chuckle. Boys will be boys. When I once hesitated during a speech at a junior investor luncheon, I was kept home from the winter gala and told to practice until the words come without nerves. So no, we weren't raised equally, but we were raised in parallel. Two heirs walking mirrored halls, one groomed in poise, the other primed for politics. Still, I did everything right. I earned top marks, took a dual degree at Oxford and Wharton, interned in Singapore during my summers, never asking for special treatment, even though I could have had it on a platinum platter. By the time I was 25, I was managing one of the company's emerging tech verticals, profitable, innovative, and quietly outperforming Daniel's flashier media acquisitions. But here's the thing about legacy families. Appearances trump results. Daniel made headlines. I made projections. He threw charity galas for endangered pandas. I balanced the books behind closed doors. And though grandfather praised me in private, I saw the way the rest of the board looked at him, like he was the sun and I was just moonlight, reflected, reserved, replaceable. Still, I trusted the process. I trusted him. Grandfather was the closest thing I had to a real parent. My own father died when I was 4. My mother, well, she remarried into oil wealth and reinvented herself as someone who didn't mention me unless it added to the conversation. So, grandfather raised me in his image, taught me how to negotiate like a knife slipping under skin, how to ask questions that sounded like praise, how to listen to silence in a boardroom and still walk out with the win. And at 27, he finally said the words I had been groomed to hear my whole life. You're ready to take over. It wasn't formal, not yet, but it was coming, a matter of timing, of optics. The press release was being drafted. The succession plan was being reviewed. I had become the Sloan heiress, the future, the crown, poised on my head. But Daniel smiled too much that week. And when he smiled like that, something always burned. We were at a charity gala in Vienna when the first thread came loose. The venue was everything old money dreams of. Chandeliers the size of small moons, violinists in tuxedos, and waiters who poured Dom Perignon like it was sparkling water. Every guest had a name printed in gold foil and a scandal only 3 people knew about. It was the kind of room Daniel thrived in. He'd already worked it like a stage by the time I arrived. Handshakes, cheek kisses, faux concern. A politician trapped in a playboy's body. If I had $1 for every time someone called him effortlessly magnetic, I'd have enough to buy back half the company he was about to burn to the ground. I showed up late on purpose. That's another thing you learn when you're raised to rule. Punctuality is polite, but lateness makes people wait. And waiting is power. I wore black satin, clean lines, no distractions. Hair tied, eyes sharpened. I wasn't there to charm. I was there to remind people who would be signing their bonuses in 2 quarters. About an hour in, I found myself cornered by one of the older board members, Alfred Green, wealthy, conservative, and just tipsy enough to forget his poker face. He swirled the last of his red wine, leaned in, and said in that tone, "Older men use when they want to sound fatherly. You know, I've always admired how you carry yourself, dear. It's not easy walking in a man's world without acting like a man." I smiled, controlled, professional. I wasn't aware I was supposed to act like anything. He chuckled, still sharp, then lowered his voice. "Listen, I'm not saying this is anything, but you might want to double-check your division's offshore dealings." My breath didn't change, but my pulse did. "Excuse me." "Just a rumor." Daniel mentioned something about irregularities. Friendly concern, I'm sure. But the board, well, we hate surprises. There it was, not a warning, a breadcrumb. Something subtle enough to dismiss, dangerous enough not to. I played it cool, thanked him, changed the subject. But the second I got back to my hotel suite, I opened my laptop. Nothing looked out of place. Financials were pristine. Sign-offs were all verified. My team was airtight. Every audit reviewed. Every transaction documented. I ran a division like a machine. There were no holes, unless someone created one. I didn't sleep that night. Not from panic yet, but from calculation. Daniel had always been petty, always theatrical. But this was layered. He wasn't attacking my position. He was questioning my trustworthiness. It was worse than defamation. It was subversion. And it worked. The next day, another board member asked, offhandedly, whether I'd seen a particular vendor invoice from 3 months ago. Just casual. A whisper under a smile. 2 days later, our legal counsel requested a review of our department's cybersecurity protocols. Then I stopped getting copied on high-level planning emails. Not removed, just omitted. And Daniel? He sent me a bottle of wine. No note, no explanation, just a smirk in gift form. I stared at that bottle for a long time. I didn't open it. I didn't return it. I left it on the shelf. A reminder of what was coming. It began, as most corporate assassinations do, with a calendar invite. Nothing dramatic, no legal envelope, just an innocuous little notification on my phone. Internal audit review, level 3, attendance required. Level 3 meant compliance risk. Level 3 meant potential fraud. The kind of meeting where no one smiles, and every answer becomes evidence. I arrived in a slate suit, tailored, sharp enough to draw blood. I greeted every partner, every advisor, every member of the internal risk team like nothing was wrong. Because I believed nothing was. I had nothing to hide. I'd built my division on transparency, precision, results. But the moment I sat down, I knew I'd been set up. On the long glass table were files, real ones, paper, annotated. Not the usual digital dashboards we used. Thick reports, bank statements, transaction logs, all bearing my signature. Except they weren't mine. The numbers added up to 4.7 million, routed through a foreign consultancy I didn't recognize. My name was listed on the authorization forms. My initials were on the release orders. My voice was allegedly in the approval voicemail. I sat there stunned, not confused but calculating. And then I saw him, Daniel, leaning casually against the wall, arms folded, lips tight around that performative look of concerned disappointment. He didn't even bother to speak. Instead, the board did the rest. Soft voices. This doesn't look good. We're not accusing you, yet. Of course, we want to give you the benefit of the doubt. But beneath every polite phrase was a single, silent truth. They'd already chosen who to believe, and it wasn't me. That week, the investigation went public. Sloan heiress under fire in corporate embezzlement scandal. My name, once associated with cutting-edge innovation and poised leadership, became synonymous with greed and betrayal. Reporters camped outside my penthouse. Former classmates released vague statements. My inbox turned to poison. I was put on leave, indefinitely. My access to company accounts revoked. Company car, gone. Security access card, disabled. Even my private driver was reassigned. The worst part wasn't the loss of status. It was the look on grandfather's face when I visited Valliswood one final time. He was in the study, pale, frail, half of his once commanding voice now missing from the stroke that had seized him 2 months prior. He couldn't yell, he couldn't plead. He could only stare. I tried to explain, tried to show him the discrepancies, the fake signatures, the timestamps that didn't align. But he didn't respond, not even a nod. He just looked at me, like I was a stranger who'd walked in wearing his granddaughter's skin. As I left, Daniel passed me on the staircase. He paused, looked me over. "Tough week," he said. "But don't worry, the board's in good hands." I didn't respond. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of rage. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't cry. Because power doesn't always explode. Sometimes it burns quietly, and waits. After the headlines hit, everything happened in whispers. There were no confrontations, no slammed doors, just polite emails from PR advising I stay quiet and let the news cycle pass. Just silence from the boardroom, where I once commanded strategy. And just like that, I became the one thing the Sloan name feared most. A liability. I wasn't escorted out. I was faded out. Digitally erased, socially omitted. Invitations stopped. So did eye contact. I wasn't uninvited to events. I was just never mentioned again. Even staff I'd personally mentored, men and women who had cried in my office and thanked me for saving their departments, suddenly forgot my name when reporters came knocking. Except Daniel. He remembered me loudly. At every press conference, he found a way to mention me, with that same glossy-eyed performance. It's a difficult time for our family. I still believe in redemption. We all make mistakes, especially under pressure. Always vague, always drenched in faux empathy, and always strategic. Because Daniel wasn't just destroying my reputation, he was building his own, brick by brick, on the ruins of my credibility. I stayed out of sight for weeks, but I watched. Oh, I watched. From my balcony, from burner accounts, from the edges of parties I used to headline. And I began noticing the patterns, the people who had aligned with Daniel before the audit, the rushed vendor contracts, the rushed votes, the subtle shift in messaging from our future to his leadership. He'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. He didn't just want the company. He wanted the narrative. He wanted me to be the cautionary tale parents whispered to their ambitious daughters. Don't reach too high. Look what happened to her. But the thing about fairy tales? The villain never sees the heroine coming when she changes genres. The penthouse didn't feel like a palace anymore. It felt like a museum exhibit, one where the centerpiece had been disgraced, but hadn't yet been removed. My name was still on the lease, but I knew it was only a matter of time before that, too, would vanish. The staff was reassigned. Deliveries stopped arriving. Even the concierge, a man I once rescued from deportation with a phone call, now spoke to me like I was trespassing in my own life. I was confined, not by bars, but by perception. No one wanted to be seen with me. No one wanted to hear my version. My phone buzzed less and less, until it stopped altogether. Even the silence had changed. It wasn't peaceful, it was curated. A silence that had been engineered, by Daniel, by the media, by the board, to be a vacuum. A void where my story should have been. I spent weeks pacing that glass cage. I watched the city sparkle beneath me like a lover that had moved on. I watched my future being auctioned off in headlines, and I watched Daniel rise, not like a king, but like a polished fraud with a perfect smile. He launched a new social campaign under the Sloan brand. Vision, values, victory. The alliteration made me want to vomit. It wasn't vision, it was theft. Not values, just optics. Victory? That was premature. Because in the midst of all that ruin, I still had one thing left. Marina, my former assistant. She wasn't just loyal, she was dangerous in the best way. Underestimated, overlooked, and so good at what she did, people forgot she was watching. She appeared at my door one rainy night with no invitation and 3 things. A laptop bag, a burner phone, and a look I hadn't seen since our last crisis in Jakarta, the look that meant she was ready to go to war. She sat down like she still worked for me. He used my name on the paperwork, she said. On the shell company, he assumed I wouldn't notice. I noticed. She handed me the burner phone. Start here. The files were encrypted, but inside were email logs, contract timestamps, flight records, connections I'd missed. Daniel hadn't just framed me. He had laundered loyalty. He bought silence, promoted incompetence, had lunches with men who wore $20,000 watches and left no digital trace. But Marina had saved everything: screenshots, voicemails, GPS tags. She even had photos of him signing documents at a dinner party in Monaco, documents dated before the fraud was discovered. That was the spark I needed. Not rage, clarity. I wasn't going to beg the board. I wasn't going to plead for the press. I was going to do what every great legacy builder does when the walls collapse. Architect something new. The day I disappeared, I didn't even pack. I left the penthouse at 3:17 a.m., wearing a coat from 3 seasons ago, and sunglasses that used to mean don't approach. Now they meant don't recognize me. Marina had it all arranged. A plane ticket under a false name, a prepaid apartment in a city I'd never lived in, a storage unit containing hard drives, legal pads, burner laptops, and one vintage watch I'd gifted her after we closed a $200 million merger, back when I thought legacy meant something. I became someone else, not legally, but emotionally. I stripped off Sloan like dead skin. I registered under a new identity, rented a modest flat above a gallery, enrolled, anonymously, in a corporate ethics certification program because, oh, the irony. During the day, I played student, quiet, focused, invisible. At night, I was an analyst, a stalker, a strategist. Every transaction I ever signed, every employee I'd ever supervised, every vendor, every leaked email, I traced it all, connected dots the investigators had deliberately missed. And then I started trading. Quietly, efficiently. Crypto, shell firms, convertible notes. I flipped a 3-month portfolio into 6 figures and funneled it into a rival firm Daniel had once mocked in an interview. I wasn't building revenge. I was building leverage. Daniel thought I was gone, that I'd folded, that I was meditating on a mountaintop somewhere, writing memoirs and licking my wounds. He didn't know I was buying up the floor beneath him. And I didn't do it alone. Marina brought in 2 more. A forensic accountant with a gambling problem and no love for Daniel. A disgraced private investigator who once caught a senator cheating on her hedge fund. I called them my off-market board. They didn't wear suits. They wore scars, and they owed me nothing, which made them perfect. We worked across time zones and aliases, set up encrypted servers, used old offshore contacts to trace the shell companies Daniel had used to frame me. And we found it. A single IP address that linked one of Daniel's shell signatories to his beach house in Sardinia. Sloppy, but poetic, because that one mistake meant every contract, every payment, every anonymous tip was now traceable back to him. It wouldn't hold in court yet, but it was enough. Enough to plant the first real crack in his polished image. Enough to begin the quiet unmaking of Daniel Sloan. The first crack wasn't public. It came in a whisper on a terrace during a rooftop cocktail hour hosted by one of Daniel's oldest allies, Edward Kells, a board member, the kind who always said integrity with a mouthful of steak tartare. Edward received an envelope. Not from me directly, never from me. It arrived by courier, sealed in navy wax, containing a single photo of Daniel, meeting with a disgraced consultant, linked to 3 offshore accounts. A brief transaction history between one of Edward's own shell companies and that same consultant, and a handwritten note, "If I fall, you fall louder." I wasn't playing hero. I wasn't exposing corruption to clean the system. I was warning the rats that the ship was rigged to explode. 2 days later, Edward began distancing himself from Daniel, quietly pulling out of joint ventures, rescheduling board engagements, reconsidering his media interviews. Not loyal, just scared. Perfect. Then came Elaine, Daniel's personal brand manager and part-time mistress, depending on which whisper you believed. She was smart, sharp, and sick of being thanked only in footnotes. Marina reached out with an offer. "Tell us what you know. We'll give you your own agency by the time this ends." Elaine didn't even hesitate. She spilled everything: passwords, burner accounts, shadow PR contracts designed to scrub Daniel's name from certain unsavory deals. She even handed over an NDA Daniel had once forced her to sign, and her digital copy of the unedited agreement. There was a clause he didn't know had survived the redlining. The undersigned may not disclose material information unless in response to federal investigation or under lawful whistleblower protection. Elaine was about to become very protected, and with her came the inner machinery. PR firm billing sheets, retainer emails, personal affairs camouflaged as consultant meetings, and expense reports. One by one, Daniel's alliances began to crack. Not because they believed me, but because I'd weaponized the one thing Daniel never respected: other people's motives. He assumed loyalty, I assumed opportunism, and I bet on it. That's how I got back in touch with grandfather's old legal counsel, Mr. Jennings. Retired, widowed, bitter. I sent him everything. Not just the fraud, but the inheritance manipulation, the rewriting of succession documents after grandfather's stroke, the forced signatures, the backdated agreements. Jennings agreed to meet. He looked at me with tired eyes, poured a glass of scotch at 10 a.m., and said, "They treated me like a fossil, like I didn't still have files locked away." I raised my glass. Time to open them. The Sloan legacy wasn't just written in ink. It was built into contracts, trust arrangements, generational clauses so airtight you could suffocate in them. But legacies have loopholes, especially when ego rewrites the fine print. Mr. Jennings had the originals, not the sanitized PDFs Daniel had buried under updates. The real ones, hand-signed, sealed in wax, and locked in a fireproof cabinet in a law office no one had set foot in since grandfather's stroke. And tucked in between those pages was something Daniel had never known to fear: a succession clause dated 5 years before his name ever entered the conversation. It stated in no uncertain terms that the Sloan family holdings would pass to the primary blood heir, demonstrating business solvency and executive integrity. I was named, not as an option, as the default. There it was, my crown, still mine, still valid, and more importantly, still enforceable. Daniel had never understood that real power isn't about attention, it's about structure. He'd controlled the board, the narrative, the public face of the Sloan empire, but I now had the architecture. I filed for a private arbitration, not a lawsuit, not yet. I wasn't interested in spectacle. I wanted leverage. The moment the claim hit Daniel's legal counsel, I knew it landed. Marina texted me just one word: rattled. Daniel released a statement that same evening about welcoming internal review and clarifying transitional documents, his version of panic. But inside the Sloan Group, things shifted. Investors started calling again, not to gloat, to hedge. Board members, once eager to avoid me, suddenly sent checking-in emails. Offers to meet, suggestions for settlement. Because if the arbitration went public, so did everything else. And trust me, I wanted it to go public. But only after I'd built the bomb. So I did what every true heir does when offered a seat at a compromised table. I flipped the table. I leaked a different story. A story about a mysterious whistleblower. About manipulated inheritance documents. About a private trust being hijacked through stroke-era opportunism. I didn't name names. But I didn't need to. The story went viral. Suddenly, the Sloan Empire wasn't a monument. It was a scandal. And Daniel? He went dark. No interviews, no press photos, no gala appearances. The golden boy dimmed. Daniel always thrived in rooms with cameras. He knew how to spin a headline, how to fake humility, how to place a trembling hand on a podium just long enough for someone to snap a flattering photo. He was a brand, not a man, all surface, no soul. But scandals, real ones, don't care about polish. When the story broke, his silence wasn't strength. It was strategy, delay, deny, outlast the noise. But this wasn't noise, it was rot. Within 72 hours of the leak, a second unaffiliated investigative blog posted screenshots. Not mine, not Marina's, independent ones. Emails between Daniel and a now-defunct PR agency discussing image recovery protocols in the event of familial betrayal. Betrayal, not embezzlement, not fraud. Betrayal. The internet exploded. Reddit threads dissected his rise like a crime scene. TikTok surfaced of former employees recounting suspicious NDAs and conveniently timed promotions. Even a former girlfriend, one he'd ghosted after a miscarriage, spoke out. Her story wasn't financial, it was emotional, and it was devastating. Daniel tried to pivot, called a press conference. He stepped up to the mic in a gray suit tailored to distraction. He spoke slowly, carefully, thanking the board, praising his sister's resilience, even invoking grandfather's name like a holy shield. But this time, no one clapped. The room was still. A reporter stood and asked, "Mr. Sloan, if these allegations are as false as you claim, why hasn't your team released the original succession documents for public verification?" Daniel blinked. The cameras zoomed in. He smiled, tightly. "Our legal team is reviewing." "You've had years to review." The reporter didn't flinch, neither did the cameras. That clip? It went viral before the conference even ended. By sunset, Sloan Group's stock had dropped 12%. By the end of the week, Daniel was suspended pending investigation. He didn't leave the building through the front. He slithered through the garage. For the first time in his life, Daniel Sloan didn't win the room. He wasn't the future. He wasn't the golden boy. He was a cautionary tale with a comb-over and a crumbling empire. And I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because this wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. When the suspension order hit Daniel's desk, I was already 10 steps ahead. I didn't want his job. I wanted the throne rebuilt, without him in the blueprint. And I had leverage, real leverage. The arbitration ruling was in. The original succession clause, valid. The manipulated paperwork, fraudulent. My removal, unlawful. Legally, the empire was mine again, but I didn't announce it. Instead, I invited them all to Valliswood. The old estate, cleaned and restored, no longer a mausoleum of the Sloan past, but a quiet, powerful stage. Polished floors, fresh paint, no ghosts, just legacy repurposed. I hosted the board, the shareholders, the family. No press, no fanfare, just truth and tea. I walked into the main hall wearing the same black satin I'd worn at that charity gala in Vienna, back when Daniel still believed reputation was stronger than blood. They looked at me with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. Some apologized. Some avoided eye contact. A few just wanted their bonuses secured. I didn't care. I laid out the new terms, clear, concise, unshakable. Sloan Holdings would be restructured. The old hierarchy dissolved. Departments flattened. Cronyism purged. The trust would be split. A portion would be reserved for philanthropic reinvestment, under my control. Daniel's shares, frozen, pending legal proceedings. No voting rights, no executive power. He could keep his suits and designer shame. There was pushback, naturally. Some of the old guard tried to stall, said we should wait and see, let the dust settle. I didn't flinch. You waited while he stole. You watched while I fell. Now you'll listen while I rebuild. There were murmurs, some resistance, but they knew the tide had turned. The court had spoken, and the empire was already being repainted in my vision. And that vision wasn't about revenge. It was about refinement, about stripping away the old rot and planting something no Sloan had ever dared. A legacy based on merit. The world expected a coronation. What they got was a restructuring. No fireworks, no dramatic press release. I didn't pose for glossy photos in glass boardrooms. I didn't announce my return with a quote about resilience or rebirth. I just got to work, because I was never the face of the empire. I was always its architect. The first thing I did? Shut down Daniel's vanity campaign, vision, values, victory. I replaced it with 3 new pillars, printed in every office lobby under my direction. Precision, purpose, proof. Every executive was required to reapply for their role. Every department head went through a performance audit. Nepotism bled out of the system like poison from a wound. The Sloan brand transformed, not into something softer, but into something sharper. We launched a mentorship initiative for women of color in finance, for former whistleblowers, for the daughters of men who had been silenced. I gave Elaine her agency, put Marina on the new board, hired Jennings as our new ethics director, and let him choose the budget. And I didn't just grow the portfolio, I rewrote its DNA. We invested in clean energy startups. We divested from conflict-fueled conglomerates. We doubled profits in 1 quarter while having our legal exposure. And Daniel, he faded, not vanished, just irrelevant. Last I heard, he was vacationing in Nice with a PR consultant and no stock options. The kind of man who still wore cufflinks even when barefoot. He sent a letter once, said he hoped we could let go of the past and remember the good years. I didn't reply because my silence was no longer submission. It was sovereignty. It wasn't a throne I wanted anymore. It was something far more rare, clarity. Weeks after the restructuring was finalized, I found myself standing at the edge of the Valliswood estate, on the same marble balcony where grandfather once told me power should never look rushed. Below me, the orchard had bloomed for the first time in years. No press, no visitors, just silence, this time not weaponized or suffocating, but earned. In my hand was a letter, not from Daniel, not from anyone inside the machine. This one came from a small equity firm in Tokyo, run by a woman I'd once met at a conference in Berlin. She'd followed the story. She wanted to invest. Not in the company, she wrote, in you. That was when I understood the weight of it all. They had tried to erase me not because I was weak, but because I was inconvenient. Too focused, too composed, too clear. They had mistaken my silence for compliance. They had mistaken my collapse for consent. But I was never broken, just buried. And now I had unearthed myself. I took the call, closed the deal, and with it, opened a new arm of the empire, Sloan Vanguard. A think tank, an incubator, and a protection ring for women like me. Women who had been outmaneuvered, outvoted, underestimated. Women who had survived their version of Daniel. I appointed a team of researchers, advocates, engineers, and disruptors. I didn't care where they'd studied. I cared where they'd been bruised and how they'd rebuilt. And they came, in droves. Not just to work, but to belong. One by one, the pillars of the old Sloan name were dismantled. Not with fanfare, but with focus. Every building got a new plaque. Every boardroom got a new name. The corner office Daniel once obsessed over? I turned it into a daycare for staff parents. Because a legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you liberate while you're still breathing. When people spoke about the Sloan Empire now, they didn't speak of men in suits or headlines in gold. They didn't mention the drama, the fall, or even the scandal. They spoke of change, of the way a legacy became a launch pad, of how a dynasty, once known for whispered betrayals and expensive secrets, became synonymous with transparency, equity, and ruthless clarity. But more than anything, they spoke of her, not as a survivor, not even as a CEO, but as something rarer, as the one who rewrote the rules. I never took Daniel to court again. I didn't need to. His empire had been hollow, built on bluffs and borrowed charm. Mine was made of steel and glass and strategy. And most importantly, it was mine. When the magazines finally reached out for interviews, I declined. I didn't want a glossy feature. I didn't want to be called resilient. I hosted my own forum instead. Invited women who'd been removed from family companies, silenced in boardrooms, accused of being too emotional to lead. We didn't talk about healing. We talked about design, about succession clauses, arbitration strategy, PR control. We weren't rebuilding in their image. We were reimagining power in ours. I sat at the head of that table, not as a queen reclaiming her court, but as a blueprint. And when one of the youngest women stood and asked, "What would you tell your younger self if you could go back?" I answered without blinking, "Don't waste time explaining your fire to people who are committed to staying cold." They clapped, not because it was poetic, but because it was practical. After the forum, I walked alone through Valliswood's East Wing. The portraits of the men who built the family fortune were still there, but I'd moved them into the library, where they belonged. The gallery now held new photographs, smiling faces, diverse, real, defiant, not heirs, architects. And in the center of the hallway, beneath soft light, and a quote etched in marble that read, "Revenge wasn't the plan, leadership was," stood a single frame, not of me, but of grandfather, and a little girl with paint on her dress, standing beside him, holding the blueprints to a treehouse she'd just insisted be built her way.